For those who have imbibed its wine, Bordeaux could conjure the aromas of blackcurrant, plums, and earthiness. Architecture enthusiasts may recall the splendid cream-coloured facades of the limestone buildings that adorn its city centre. An evening spent at its opera house wouldn't easily be forgotten. Yet underneath this charming assortment of cultural attractions lurks a murky past that, like France's national motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, is replete with contradictions and compromise, smoothed over by the regenerative power of declaring a new republic. In May 1940, when German tanks rolled into France via neutral Belgium, all seemed lost. French morale deteriorated so quickly that after only 5 days, the French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud telephoned the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and said, "We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle." But by mid-June, Reynaud and his government were held up in Bordeaux, looking to solicit all the Allied help they could get in the fight against Hitler's Wermacht and to keep the flame of liberty alive in France. It is a curious fact of history, then, that Bordeaux, once the final outpost of official French resistance, should become what was later described as a fortress of defeatism and the birthplace of the collaborationist Vichy government. The France that crumbled upon invasion was a nation at war with itself, still railing from the societal sores opened up by the Dreyfus affair and the devastation inflicted by World War I, not to mention old cleavages dating back to the Revolution. French conservatives, like Bordeaux's wine barons or aristocracy of the Cork, were often more fearful of their communist countrymen than the invading Germans. And in the words of historian Nicholas Stargard, their new conquerors were young, generous, newly wealthy, and settling into a country where 1.5 million Frenchmen had just been removed. Apart from the minority in the resistance, most Frenchmen just wanted to get on with life, doing their best to feed themselves and their families while forking out food and finance to the increasingly insatiable and overextended German war machine. So conditions were ripe for collaboration, and some were more enthusiastic than others. Enter Maurice Papon, a nimble, efficient, and highly ambitious bureaucrat who served as the Secretary General of Police in Bordeaux during the war. He was the man tasked with rounding up and deporting the district's Jewish population, largely from Mériadeck, the city's financial district. The first train of deportees left Bordeaux in July 1942, accompanied by what one historian described as an eerie silence when compared to the popular uproar when 650,000 French workers were deported to Germany to undertake manual labour the following year. So meticulous was Papon in executing his assignment that when there weren't enough Jews to justify requisitioning a bus, he would personally sign off on taxi fares. He was responsible for the deportation of over 1,600 Jews. Papon's ignominious wartime record was no barrier to his career in the years that followed. He was awarded the Legion of Honor, the most important and prestigious award the French state can bestow, by President Charles de Gaulle in 1961, and following a string of promotions, became Minister of the Budget from 1978 to 81. In a way, his case is so interesting not because of its uniqueness, but because of how decidedly commonplace people like Papon were, and how illustrative it is of France's experience, both during and after the war. Far from a conquered people reluctantly swept along by the fascist agenda of their new masters, France was a willing, active, and to some degree autonomous participant in the Nazi project. As historian Andrew Roberts highlights in his book, The Storm of War, regime is a misnomer when applied to Vichy, as it was the legally constituted government of occupied France. While Vichy rejected Nazi proposals to introduce the identifying Star of David armbands, and, at least initially, resisted deporting Jews that were of French origin, it also showed initiative in adopting anti-Jewish policies before the Nazis requested them. It was thanks to the enthusiastic compliance of Vichy and those, like Papon, who served it, that, as historian Tony Jutt notes in his landmark book Post-War, A History of Europe Since 1945, most of the Jewish deportees from France never saw a foreign uniform until they were handed over to the Germans for final shipment to Auschwitz from the train yards at Drancy, north of Paris. This is a fact that post-war France was reluctant to grapple with, so much so that the only histories detailing the extent of French collaboration appearing in the mid-60s and 70s, were penned by foreign historians. When Papon was eventually brought to trial for crimes against humanity in 1997, Jutt notes that a number of French historians, called to attend as expert witnesses, refused to appear. Despite the queasiness of his compatriots, much pearl-clutching from swathes of the French elite, Papon was eventually convicted of crimes against humanity and sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, 3 of which he served. He died at 96 after an early release from jail. The significance of Papon's trial lay not in convicting an octogenarian of crimes that occurred half a century prior, but, Jutt argues, to establish conclusively that the distinction between Vichy and France, so carefully drawn by everyone from Presidents de Gaulle to Mitterrand, had never existed. In what could be a fitting obituary for the man as well as the governments he served, Jutt writes, Papon was a Frenchman who served the Vichy regime and subsequent French Republic, both of which were fully aware of his activities in the Bordeaux prefecture, and neither of which was troubled by them. Indeed, this complicity wasn't limited to French officials. As late as 1953, the citizens of Bordeaux found no objection with casting their vote in municipal elections for Adrien Marquet, the city's openly fascist former mayor. In his book France and the Nazis, American journalist Adam Nossiter notes that during the war, this well-tailored dentist with a short moustache had complained to the SS that Vichy was full of Jews. Clearly the ethnic cleansing, or de-Judification of France, could not happen fast enough for Bordeaux's mayor. Excepting the odious Julius Streicher, it is hard to recall another individual for whom Nazi anti-Semitism was too middle of the road. Marquet's trial and conviction for services to Vichy in 1940 is telling, coming as it did before his election victory and attended, as it was, by a number of Bordeaux's important personages. Perhaps more damning from the city's perspective is his lawyer's argument, relayed by Nossiter, that the entire city of Bordeaux understood and accepted this man. And in spite of the fact it did not have its own resistance, Nossiter continues, Bordeaux went on to name more of its streets for resistance heroes than any town of its size in France. In 1995, by which time most of those tainted by Vichy were ailing or long dead, President Jacques Chirac broke a 50-year taboo by publicly acknowledging his country's complicity in the extermination of the Jews of Europe. France, the homeland of the Enlightenment and of the rights of man, a land of welcome and asylum, on that day committed the irreparable, Chirac said of the deportations. Breaking its word, it handed those who were under its protection over to their executioners. France owes the victims an everlasting debt, he concluded. It is understandable that emerging from World War II, battered, bruised and humiliated, France's new president and national saviour, Charles de Gaulle, crafted a convenient post-war myth, one where both French helplessness and resistance at the hands of a brutal occupying force feature prominently. And as Alan Judd wrote in the Sunday Times, we who have not known hunger have no idea how empty bellies debilitate and dominate, and should therefore refrain from passing judgment. But the ease with which a state, a region, even a person can morph from one thing to another, aided by a selective memory, should give us pause for thought. Under the right conditions, would Britain have done the same? Like all counterfactuals, it is as impossible to resist asking the question as it is to come up with an answer. We can only hope that we never have to find out.